The songs that Aaron chose this morning made me think of family. The first song, "To God Be the Glory," is my mother's favorite hymn. To God be the glory. And then "Freely, Freely." A few years ago, I have a sister-in-law named Rochelle. That was her favorite song, was "Freely, Freely." I don't know if it still is now, but it was then. And then Friday of this past week, Nancy and I, we had the opportunity to go to Fort Wayne and visit my mom at Byron Medical Center in Fort Wayne, where she's in the memory care unit with dementia. And the past few times we have gone to visit Mom, she hasn't known who we are. I mean, this has been for quite a while now. She doesn't know who we are. But it was interesting because Nancy, when we walked into Mom's room, she says, "And you know who this guy is?" and pointed to me. And she says, "Yeah, that's David." And I thought, she remembers me. And then she said, "My husband." Well, you know, you take what you get, and but my second favorite hymn is "Blessed Assurance," which we also sang today. My favorite is "Great is Thy Faithfulness." That's my favorite song. But "Blessed Assurance" is my second favorite song. So we were there with Mom, and Nancy's really good at getting her cell phone out, and Mom loves to listen to the old hymns on Nancy's cell phone. So she said, "What hymn would you like to have played today, Mom?" And as usual, she doesn't really ever request one, but we give her that opportunity. And I said, "Well, play Blessed Assurance." And so Nancy plays Blessed Assurance on her cell phone, and she said, "Blessed Assurance," and Mom said right away, "Jesus is mine." The rest of our visit, Mom walked around that facility telling everybody, "Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine." She kept repeating that over and over and over. And Nancy and I, it was like, this is beautiful. You know, she remembered that when we said "Blessed Assurance," she knew that next part. Jesus is mine. So when we hear these songs, think of how important some of those words are. I mean, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Well, we continue our sermon series today called "Conquering the Mountains." Conquering the Mountains. And we will have two more messages. Next week, I'm going to be preaching on moving from materialism to contentment. All right? Moving from materialism to contentment. And I think the last one I'm going to do is moving from grief to acceptance. I'm thinking about doing that one. But today, we're going to focus in on this idea of moving from bitterness to forgiveness. Moving from bitterness to forgiveness. Some of you have probably heard the story about the man. It's been a number of years ago. There was a man that went to see his doctor, and the man thought he had rabies. And this is before the days where they had a vaccine for rabies. And so he went to see his doctor, and they ran all kinds of tests on him, and they found out, sure enough, he did. He tested positive for rabies. Well, then the doctor decided he was having a hard time trying to figure out how he was going to tell him about that pretty bad diagnosis. And so he went to the man, and he told him, he says, "There's no other way I can tell you, but you tested positive for rabies, and there's no cure, and you probably better put your house in order." I told him that, and the man thought about it. He was silent for a minute, and then he said to the doctor, "Can you give me a pen and some paper?" And so the doctor provided for him the materials he needed. And he sat down and he started writing furiously. The doctor left the room. After about an hour, the doctor came back. And he was still writing. He had his head down, he was still writing. And the doctor said, well, that's great. He said that you're preparing your will and putting your house in order. And he said, that's not what I'm writing. I'm not writing my will. He says, I'm writing down a list of everybody that I want to bite. Moving from bitterness to forgiveness. Over the past few years, we have seen many times where there were mass killings in our country by people suffering from mental illness, much of which was brought on as a result of bitterness that just began to just overtake them over a long period of time. I was thinking about Sutherland Springs in Texas, that church shooting back in 2017 that left 26 people dead. How about Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut? That was 2012, left 26 also dead, 20 children and 6 adults. How about the shooting on the campus of Virginia Tech University in 2007, where you had 33 people killed there? How about the Orlando nightclub shooting in 2016? That was 49 people killed. And the Country Music Festival that took place in Las Vegas in 2017, where 61 people were killed. And so we have these mass killings. A lot of it's mental illness, obviously, but a lot of it is also this whole thing about bitterness and anger that people feel. Hebrews 12:15 says, "See to it that no one misses the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." Ephesians 4:31 says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice." The whole idea about get rid of grudges. Someone has said bitterness is an attitude that refuses to forgive an offense. Bitterness is an attitude that refuses to forgive an offense. Bitterness can be defined as anger multiplied by time and attention. Bitterness, it just festers in a person until it comes out many times in different ways. You've probably heard this said, anger is the acid that can harm the vessel in which it is stored even more than the person on whom it is poured. Now, who is our example about this idea of needing to move from bitterness to forgiveness? And by the way, he never did. He never did. King David. If you turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 2, 1 Kings chapter 2, I'm going to share with you the fact that David is 70 years old. All right, at this point, he became king when he was 30. He reigned in Hebron and Jerusalem for a combined amount of time, 40 years, which, by the way, was the same amount as King Saul. Both of them ruled for the same amount, 40 years. Okay. He is at the point of death, so he calls his son in to the palace, into a room, his son Solomon, and he begins to give Solomon some of his instructions, knowing he's dying. 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 1 says, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. By the way, these first 4 verses here in 1 Kings chapter 2, what David says, I don't know that a father could give better instruction than what David says here in those 4 verses. He tells Solomon, in everything you do, put the Lord first. Put the Lord first. All right? The problem is what David says from verse 5 on. The first 4 are really, really good instruction and advice for Solomon. He says in verse 2, I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. The same thing was said of Joshua when he was dying. It means I'm about ready to go to the grave. So be strong, show yourself a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements, as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go. And that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. That's quite a promise. David says, if you obey God's word, if you walk faithfully with the Lord, there will never be a time where there's not a descendant of our family serving as king on a throne. Never. Wow. So he talks about put the Lord first, verses 1 through 4. But the second part of this, he says to Solomon, protect the kingdom. Protect the kingdom. Look at what he says in verse 5. Now you yourself know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me. What he did to the 2 commanders of Israel's armies, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime as if in battle. And with that blood stained the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. You see, now the statement that David gives to Solomon as he is dying is a message that's full of resentment and revenge. Revenge. And he basically warns Solomon that there are 2 men that he needs to be very careful with who could be threats to the throne. They're dangerous men. One is Joab. But what David is going to give Solomon as he is dying is a grudge list of people that he takes a grudge to the grave. Joab. Who was Joab? Joab was the commander of David's army. Joab was David's nephew. Joab was loyal and faithful to David many times and through many trials that David had. Joab was faithful to him and loyal. But as you study the story of Joab in the Old Testament, he's a guy that always seemed to have his own agenda. There was always something else going on with Joab, all right? And so that's what David says about him. He says that he killed Abner and Amasa in peacetime as if it was in battle. Joab's actions were unlawful assassinations. He just assassinated these 2 men. Another thing about Joab that I believe comes into play real strong here, it was Joab who killed David's son Absalom. All right? Think about that one for a moment. And David had warned all of his soldiers to take Absalom alive. Don't kill him. And Joab found Absalom hanging by a tree by his hair. He had long hair. He was hanging by a tree with his hair, and Joab just took a sword to him and killed him. Joab, later in this chapter, he would support Adonijah in taking the throne in an attempt to take the throne from David and Solomon. Joab was an interesting character. Hard to understand, this guy. But David said of him, he's telling Solomon, don't let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. Wow. Now there's that word I like in verse 7, but. In contrast to what has just been said about Joab, David says this to Solomon, but show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. They stood by me when I fled from your brother Absalom. It's interesting, Barzillai was an old man. He had a number of sons, and when David was literally running for his life from his son Absalom, Barzillai provided for David and his men on the run bread and supplies. Okay? And David, as he's thinking, he's in his last hours or days, he says, we need to reward the household of Barzillai. Reward them for their kindness to me. And so then he said, I want his sons to eat at the king's table for the rest of their lives. All right? And Solomon obviously carried that out. He carried it out. David, you'll see, there's good and bad in what David says to Solomon. Some of it's really good. First 4 verses, verse 7 is really good. But it's the other stuff. It's the other stuff. This grudge list. And by the way, David did not have 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. We have that verse. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love keeps no record of wrongs. David didn't have that verse. He didn't have it. Jim Elliot, many of you recognize that name. Jim Elliot was a missionary to the Auca Indian tribe of Ecuador in 1956. Jim Elliot, along with 4 other men, were murdered and martyred by that Auca Indian tribe. It's become a book. You've seen the movie, Edge of the Spear. And, it's a fascinating thing. But Jim Elliot left a diary. And one of the things that Jim Elliot said in his diary is a tremendous statement. He says, when it comes time to die, make sure that all you have to do is die. I really like that. That there's no unfinished business. That there's no broken relationships that have to be repaired. When it comes time to die, make that all you have to do is die. And by the way, Jim Elliot died at the age of 28. He was 28. Look at verse 8. We're going to pick up the second guy that David tells Solomon, warns him about, that he could be a threat to his throne. He was a dangerous man. Verse 8, and remember you have with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went to Mahanaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. That story is in 2 Samuel chapter 16, verses 5 through 14, where David, he and his men come into Mahanaim, and there is Shimei. And the Bible says that Shimei cursed David, called him bloody, called him violent, started to curse at him over and over. He also picked up stones, and he threw those stones at David and David's officials. And we know specifically he picked up dirt from the ground and threw the dirt at David. One of David's men who understood to curse a king was a death penalty. You curse a king, it's immediate death. One of David's men took out his sword and he says, let me cut his head off. And David said, no. How do you know that God isn't speaking through him to curse me? Maybe God wants him to curse me. So he made a promise with Shimei, I will spare your life. I'm not going to kill you. All right? Verse 9, but now do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. Haven't we seen that before? What he's telling Solomon is, I made a promise that I would never spare Shimei's life. You didn't make that promise. So go ahead and kill him. David took those two grudges, my friends, to his grave. And many people today do the very same thing. And many of them are Christians. Because they will not move from bitterness, from resentment, from revenge to forgiveness. You know how that story ended? Solomon has a decision to make. Okay, what do I do with Shimei? So he tells Shimei, here's your punishment. You need to go back to the city of Jerusalem. Build your house. Build yourself a house there. You need to stay inside the city of Jerusalem. If you ever leave the city of Jerusalem, you will be killed. Confined to Jerusalem. For 3 years, the Bible tells us for 3 years, Shimei obeyed what Solomon had said. But after 3 years had gone by, something happened. Shimei had at least 2 slaves. These 2 slaves decided that they were going to run away. They went to a place called Gath, which was about 25 miles away from Jerusalem. At this point, Shimei had a decision to make. Do I go after these 2 runaway slaves, or do I get someone else to go try to get those slaves and bring them back to Jerusalem? He made the wrong decision. He went after the 2 slaves himself. He got the 2 slaves. When he returned to Jerusalem, Solomon's men were waiting. Solomon sits down with Shimei and he says to him, you knew what your punishment was, and you disobeyed that punishment. And then he also informs him, and I haven't forgotten what you did to my father. When you cursed him and you threw stones at him and threw dirt at him. And Solomon then had one of his men kill Shimei. In verse 31, Joab is killed. In verse 46 of this chapter, Shimei is killed. Both of the two men against whom David held grudges now have been killed. Both of them. So what does this say to us? How do we move from bitterness to forgiveness? One of my favorite authors today, and I know Nancy refers to him also, is a man by the name of Ray Pritchard. Ray Pritchard. A longtime pastor, but now he's primarily an author and a conference speaker. Used to pastor a large church up in Illinois. Ray Pritchard, to me, is in the same class as David Jeremiah and Chuck Swindoll. And I don't put too many men up there, but I would put Ray Pritchard up there. A few years ago, I preached a message here on forgiveness, and I used one of the things that he wrote on what forgiveness is not. I'm not so sure in the Church of Jesus Christ today if we understand the subject of forgiveness very well. I think there's a lot of different definitions to what that word means, and I'm not so sure we have a real good handle on it, to be honest with you, what it means to forgive. But he wrote 15 things that what forgiveness is not. And when I preached this message a few years ago, I took those handouts and I put them on the Welcome Center, and every single one of them was taken. Every single one of them. I've put some copies on the Welcome Center today. Feel free to take those. This is what forgiveness is not. Let me give them to you, and then I will close with an illustration. And then you can enjoy the beautiful weather before the bottom falls out. By the way, that is according to the National Weather Service. If it doesn't go that way, don't shoot the messenger. All right. All right. What forgiveness is not? It does not mean approving of what someone else did. It does not mean pretending that evil never took place. And when I think of that, I think of Old Testament Joseph in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, where he said, "You meant evil against me, but God turned it into good to save many people." All right? So they wouldn't starve during the famine. God used what you did against me for good so that people wouldn't starve during a famine. Joseph identified the fact, what you did to me was evil. It was just flat out evil. You know, this forgiveness thing, sometimes it's a difficult thing, and I'll tell you why. This may come as a shock to you, but you know, I've been doing this now as a pastor for about 41 years, and not everyone has liked me. You know, I almost feel like I ought to tell you, just go ahead and boo me right now. You know. But no, not everyone has liked me. And I've gone through some things that you wouldn't believe. And I haven't forgotten them. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Forgiveness is not forgetting. If you think Jesus forgot the cross, examine your mind. Because I can tell you, he didn't forget the cross. Let me give you some more. It does not mean making excuses for other people's bad behavior. It does not mean justifying evil so that sin somehow becomes less sinful. It does not mean overlooking abuse. It does not mean denying that others tried to hurt you repeatedly. You know, at that point, I hear somebody saying, "But Pastor Dave, you don't know what somebody did to me. You don't know what they did to me." It does not mean letting others walk all over you. It doesn't mean that when you're a Christian, you become a doormat that everybody steps on. It doesn't mean that. It does not mean refusing to press charges when a crime has been committed. I've been in that situation 2 times as a pastor. Crimes have been committed against the church. that I pastored. And the law enforcement came to me and asked if I was going to press charges. It does not mean refusing to press charges when a crime has been committed. It does not mean forgetting the wrong that was done. It does not mean pretending that you were never hurt. Forgiveness is not denial. It's not denial. Acting as if something never happened. It does not mean that you must restore the relationship to what it was before. It does not mean that you must become best friends again. It doesn't mean that. It does not mean there must be a total reconciliation as if nothing ever happened. It does not mean that you must tell the person that you have forgiven them. You forgive the person from your heart. You don't necessarily, if you can go and tell them you forgive them, that's fine, but it's not required for forgiveness. It's not required. It does not mean that all negative consequences of sin are canceled. So if you want that printout, it's on the Welcome Center. Feel free to take them. In his book, You Can Win with Love, it's a book written by Dale Galloway. Dale Galloway writes a lot of motivational things. He writes a lot of books that are addressed to leaders. I've read a number of Dale Galloway's stuff. But he tells a story, that I love this story for forgiveness. He tells the story of John D. Rockefeller. If you remember John D. Rockefeller, he was the man that made a fortune through Standard Oil, that Standard Oil empire that they had. I had a secretary a few years ago that whenever her children would come into the office asking her for money, she would say, "Who do you think I am, Rockefeller?" That was the response. And then she'd always give them money. Rockefeller was a man who demanded high performance from his company executives. You could probably expect that. Then one day, one of those executives made a $2 million mistake. $2 million. Word of the man's enormous error quickly spread throughout the executive offices, and the other men began to make themselves scarce. Afraid of Rockefeller's reaction, they didn't even want to cross his path. One man didn't have any choice since he had already scheduled an appointment with the boss. He walked into Rockefeller's office. Rockefeller looked up from the piece of paper upon which he was writing. "I guess you've heard about the $2 million mistake our friend made," he said abruptly. "Yes," the executive said, expecting Rockefeller to explode. "Well, I've been sitting here listing all of our friend's good qualities on this sheet of paper, and I've discovered that in the past he has made us many more times the amount he lost for us today by his one mistake. His good points far outweigh this one human error. So I think we ought to forgive him. Don't you?" Let's pray. Father God, this moving from bitterness to forgiveness is a difficult thing to do. It's so easy to compile a grudge list. But Father, I pray for anyone who's here today that is struggling in the forgiveness department. Father God, that they will be able to find peace, that it won't turn into bitterness or anger, and it won't just fester. Lord, I pray that as each one of us identify maybe who that person is that we need to forgive, that maybe this afternoon some phone calls will be made, some visits will be made. Father God, may it be said of Camden Missionary Church that not one person at Camden Missionary Church took a grudge to their grave. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. You are dismissed.